100 years ago this month, The Hunchback of Notre Dame was released in theaters and started what is now known as the Universal Monster Movies. This is my favorite movie franchise, and to commemorate its centennial, I decided to rank all the 40 plus movies from F-list to A-list. Keep in mind that my voice is going to change throughout this video because it'll take me more than one sitting to tell my thoughts on all these movies, and with each rating category I'm going to place these movies in chronological order. So here goes. This is my ranking of the Universal Monster Movies. Starting with the F-list is for a movie that I think is not just a bad movie, but the worst movie in the whole video. The Mummy Tomb of the Dragon Emperor is a terrible movie. It felt like a child trying to tell a story and making up as they go along. The tone of this movie was too goofy with the bad jokes, Marabello is no Rachel Weisz, Luke Ford is just a bad actor, and the few actors who do come back are just poorly written. The D-list consists of movies that I think are generally flawed, and I have very little if any positive things to say about them. The Invisible Woman is a painfully unfunny movie. The jokes feel like the worst material from the Three Stooges, the villain is just lame, and the chemistry between the Invisible Woman character and her love interest is non-existent. Although some of the invisibility effects are fine, and I did like John Barrymore as the eccentric scientist. Son of Dracula is a movie with a misleading title where it's never explained if the title character is the son of Dracula or Dracula himself. Regardless, Lon Chaney Jr. was painfully miscast as the European-based vampire, and the pacing of this movie is iffy. Although I did like the idea of the noir aspect mixed with the gothic supernatural story, but it does have its share of technical blunders. The Invisible Man's Revenge is a generic revenge story with invisibility effects that are hit or miss. For instance, this shot is great, but this effect is terrible. The main character's revenge plan is a little messy, and having him get killed by a dog at the end was disappointing. The Mummy's Curse is the weakest and final movie in the Karras Mummy movies. A lot of mummy action feels like a Benny Hill skit where the mummy is just chasing around leading lady, who does look pretty striking in that black wig of hers. The movie does have one of the most effective kills of the Karras movies, and I did like the climactic inclusion of Karras bringing down part of a building just to kill a guy. She-Wolf of London should not be even considered a Universal Monster movie because there is no werewolf in this movie, but because it's attached to the Legacy collection of Wolfman movies, it technically qualifies. It plays more like a Sherlock Holmes story, but the mystery is so poorly written that even Scrappy-Doo could have cracked the case. It is barely an hour long and has little story to justify its runtime, but it is mercifully short. Abbott and Costello Meet the Mummy is the least funny of the Abbott and Costello movies I've ever seen. I'm struggling to remember any joke in this movie that made me laugh. The mummy in this movie looks like someone wearing a cheap Halloween costume from Target while rolling around in manure. The only positive thing I'll say about it is that it featured Michael Cera, who voiced Mr. Freeze from Batman the Animated Series. The Creature Walks Among Us is a sad and disappointing conclusion to the trilogy of Creature from the Black Lagoon movies. Aside from the movie taking too long to get going, it is sad that the Gill-Man was stripped of his uniqueness by being turned into a generic Frankenstein monster ripoff. The message that was a lot more subtle in the previous movies of showing the dark side of science is completely lost here. But I did like Lee Snowden, who could rival Julie Adams in a white bathing suit, and I did like the moment of the Gill-Man attacking the men. The 1979 version of Dracula is a movie that I don't care much for, but I find the history of the making of this movie to be more interesting. Frank Langella's Dracula is overly romantic and not scary whatsoever. The love scene with him and his love interest is painfully dated, and the way that Dracula dies at the end is just a mix of being pretentious and yet underwhelming at the same time. The 2017 remake of The Mummy is a generic summer popcorn flick with Tom Cruise. The actor can be blamed for micromanaging this movie, but I also blame an inexperienced director and a studio that tried too hard to cash in on the cinematic universe trend. I liked the zero-gravity aircraft sequence, and Sofia Boutella as the title character of the movie was decent, but this whole movie felt like it was on autopilot for most of the time, and it was just clunky trying to place an exposition for a cinematic universe. The C-list is for movies that I think are either average in terms of quality, or mixed bags where the things I liked and disliked were equal. Werewolf of London is a fine werewolf movie, but with a protagonist that's not very likable, nor is very compelling. The werewolf makeup is pretty good, and it was nice to see Valerie Hobson again, even though she's playing the same character as she did in Bride of Frankenstein. It is strange to see a werewolf put clothes on instead of ripping them off, and it is unintentionally funny seeing a werewolf get knocked out by a branch. The Mummy's Hand is a typical adventure comedy with Egypt and mummies. It does have semi-interesting characters, mainly the magician and his daughter, but the comic relief at times can come off as too try-hard and more quantity than quality. This was the first and only time where they try to show Karras having no eyes, but it's inconsistent where you can see his eyes from time to time. The Ghost of Frankenstein showed that the Frankenstein series had ran its course and was getting long in the tooth. Aside from a stellar performance from Bela Lugosi as Igor, Boris Karloff's absence as the monster is felt, even though Lon Chaney Jr. Jr. did the best he could to play someone who was no longer an interesting character. I did like the twist of Igor's brain now being the body of the monster, but he cannot see because his blood type did not match. Invisible Agent is one of the dime a dozen World War II propaganda movies to convince audiences to buy war bonds. It does have some of the best effects in the whole Invisible series in the Universal monster movies, and it's also nice to see Alone and Maisie being as much eye candy as a spectacle. Although some of the dialogue does come off more like the writer on a soapbox, and it's awkward to see Peter Lorre play a Japanese man. The Mummy's Tomb is my favorite of the Kars movies. Sure, The Mummy's Hand has better characters, but this one has better pacing and action. The kills are on average more effective, and the climax is a lot better with the trope of the angry mob and a big fire defeating Kars at the end. I also think that Turan Bey was a better villain than Anerhab, and was not much of a stretch that he would fall for Lisa Knox's character. The 1943 version of Phantom of the Opera is impressive with its technical scope and opera scenes, but it does distract from a movie that has less horror and more drama. The makeup on the Phantom is sadly underwhelming, and the story had too many men battling for Christine's affection. While Susanna Foster is as lovely as her singing voice, it would have been fine to have a love triangle, but adding the Phantom into the mix was a bit too much. The Mummy's Ghost is just another generic mummy movie with a few good gems, such as John Carradine, and for the ending being a tragic one that was rare for its time. I always liked John Carradine in the Universal monster movies hamming up in a good way, and it was also nice to see Martha Vickers' cameo. The 2010 remake of The Wolfman is the one movie in this whole video that I'm the most conflicted with. It does have things I like a lot, such as the werewolf makeup by Rick Baker and Dave Elzy, the soundtrack that was partially done by Danny Elfman, the excellent performance by Anthony Hopkins, and the creepy atmosphere. But I did think that Benicio del Toro was sort of miscast, and the way that his character was written was too tragic. The pacing is too fast in the theatrical cut, but too slow in the uncut version. Renfield was a semi-enjoyable comedy about Dracula's familiar. Both Nicolas Cage and Nicholas Hoult were truly excellent in this movie. I sort of liked the mixture of horror and comedy, but I could tell that the movie was edited a bit too much. In addition, as much as I felt that Awkwafina was funny, she was miscast as a police officer who had no chemistry with Nicholas Hoult, and the movie's conclusion was a bit too convenient. The Last Voyage of the Demeanor is a classic example of a movie starting off good, but goes downhill as it goes along. I like the tone of the movie, the realistic practical makeup, and some of the acting from the cast, but what holds this movie back are some of the contemporary cliches, and some plot holes that sinks this movie that should have been better. The B-list has movies that I like. These are not the kind of movies that I love, but enjoy a good amount, and would generally recommend. The Hunchback of Notre Dame is responsible for the Universal monster movies. It is a sheer spectacle with how many people there were in the movie as extras, and the recreation of the Notre Dame Cathedral is a wonderment to behold. I really liked Lon Chaney Sr. a lot as a deformed but sympathetic Quasimodo, but I found the rest of the cast to be a little too average, and you can feel the length of the movie at times. The Spanish version of Dracula is an interesting piece of movie history that depicts alternate and sometimes unfilmed moments from the Bela Lugosi Dracula movie. I do like it as part of a look into what if the movie industry was dominated by another language aside from English, but I do find the movie to be a bit overrated. I get that people want to bring more attention to the movie, but trying to say that it's superior to the Bela Lugosi movie is absurd. The movie has too many scenes where the pacing drags it down with all its excess, Carlos Villares as Dracula is too hammy, and the actor playing Professor Van Helsing is a textbook definition of overacting. The original Mummy from 1932 is a solid horror movie. The best thing about it are its leading actors. I've always loved Boris Karloff's reserved but imposing performance, and how he acts coming back to life is great acting. Zita Johann is also good as a woman who's conflicted between her identity as Helen Grosvenor and as a princess from thousands of years ago. I also like the Egyptian setting, but the movie borrows too many elements from Dracula with Bela Lugosi. It could also be argued that they just remade the same movie but swapped a vampire for a mummy. Dracula's Daughter is a decent follow-up to Dracula, but a movie that tries too hard at times to copy James Whale's humor. I did like the idea of if the main character is a vampire or having a mental delusion, and Gloria Holden steals the show as Countess Maria Zelska, but I think that the label of the movie having lesbian undertones is overblown. The Countess clearly is interested in Dr. Jeffrey Garth, and there is even some sexual tension between the Countess and her manservant. Son of Frankenstein was the final time that Boris Karloff would play the monster. It's always nice to see him him as that character, but this is when the character started to become uninteresting, and it is easily overshadowed by Bela Lugosi's performance as Igor. I love the set design and the idea of Henry Frankenstein's son trying to redeem his family's name, but the movie also suffers from being overly bloated in its runtime. The Invisible Man Returns is a worthwhile sequel and an often overlooked movie. Vincent Price is perfect as the title character of the movie with his unique voice. The drama is played up very well throughout the movie, and much of the invisibility effects are very stellar. I also like the interactions he has with his love interest up the drama, and the story was switched to an invisible character going from an antagonist from the first movie to a protagonist this time around. But the things that hold it back is that the first act is a bit sluggish, and some of the moments in between the scenes without Price's character could have benefited with an additional rewrite. Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman historically is the first cinematic universe movie ever made, and it's a good time for anyone to watch. I love the opening scene of the grave robbers resurrecting the Wolfman, the song number that it serves Larry Talbot, and the final fight between the Wolfman and the monster, although it is a bit too brief. I didn't like that Bela Lugosi's lines were pretty much muted to add confusion to the continuity from the Ghost of Frankenstein, and it was strange to see the good doctor character all of a sudden would be tempted to harness the power of the monster. House of Frankenstein is a very enjoyable movie with good performances, the best being from Boris Karloff as the vengeful scientist, and from Peter J. Naish as the hunchback assistant who is desperately in love with a woman who is in love with someone else. While it does have good production quality and entertainment value, it suffers from being a bit disjointed in its structure where the scenes come off as more episodic than a coherent story, and the Dracula character was almost inconsequential to the movie. House of Dracula tends to be the most disliked monster mash movie of its time, but I think it's a criminally underrated movie. Sure, the movie is cheap looking, the climax is rushed, and it was sad that the most likable character was robbed of a happy ending. I found it to be a satisfying end to the Wolfman story. It was so satisfying seeing Larry Talbot get cured. John Carradine was able to show off how good he was as Dracula. The isolated story had the movie focus more on its story and characters, while also making the hunchback character a good person for once, and it helps that she's played by a beautiful woman. Abbott and Costello Meet the Invisible Man is basically a remake of The Invisible Man Returns, but this time the main characters doubled down the comedy and with sports added into the mix. I did enjoy the third act of the movie where Lou Costello pretends to be a professional boxer and all the scenes involving invisibility, but the movie is not paced very well and noticeably recycles footage from the past mentioned movie. Revenge of the Creature is a movie that I admit is not well written and it's more like an advertisement to visit the state of Florida, but I do enjoy this movie. Sure, the Gill Man's eyes look like ping pong balls, but I was very entertained with the scenes of the Gill Man on a rampage, and it's nice to see more of that character in this movie than the first one. It's the kind of movie that I watch on Svengoolie, and it's fine escapism. The Mummy Returns is a fun popcorn flick. Sure, there are plot conveniences, such as Rick being the chosen one, and Evelyn just so happened to be a descendant of the woman who just saw Imhotep and Noxtinamun kill Seti I, and emphasizes more on action than horror, but it's a fun movie that I've always enjoyed watching. The effects are hit or miss. The Scorpion King monster is terrible, but seeing the soldier mummies come back was great, and the chase across London is always a thrill to watch. Dracula Untold is a very solid and entertaining movie. I like Luke Evans as a humanized version of Dracula. I love his chemistry with the lovely Sarah Gadon. The soundtrack is very good, the effects have aged extremely well, and it has a lot of entertainment value, but the movie suffers from being too short in its runtime, and the villains are a little too forgettable. The 2020 version of The Invisible Man is a nice change of direction compared to the failed Dark Universe. I like the reimagining of the character that made The Invisible Man scary again, and the undertones of the dangers of technology. Elizabeth Moss gives her best performance in this movie, and Oliver Jackson Cohen is extremely good as a calculating sociopath. But unlike Dracula Untold, the movie can feel a bit too long at times, and there were a few moments in the story that felt overly convenient. And finally is the A-list. These are my favorite of the Universal monster movie franchise, and I would highly recommend them. The 1925 version of The Phantom of the Opera is undoubtedly the best and most accurate adaptation of the book of the same name. No other actor came close to matching the iconic makeup that Lon Chaney Sr. wore in this movie, and it still is impressive generations later. The sets and the cinematography gives the movie a haunting edge that very few movies of the decade could match, and as someone who has personally visited the Paris Opera House, the people at Universal did a great job recreating the interior. The 1931 version of Dracula is my favorite of the old school Universal monster movies, and it's one of my favorite movies of all time. Bela Lugosi's performance is amazing where he balances being a suave gentleman while also being a soulless killer at the same time. Dwight Frye is also amazing as his assistant Renfield, and his monologue about rats is great.
Rats. 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 Foul. Millions of them.
I also love the cinematography by Karl Freund, and the whole movie feels like going through a morbid dream they just don't want to wake up from. Frankenstein is the best movie version of the Mary Shelley book, and many people would agree. Boris Karloff's performance as the violent yet sympathetic monster is impressive as the makeup by Jack Pierce. The movie is filled with so many iconic moments.
It's alive!
To the introduction of the monster, and the iconic windmill scene. Colin Clive is also good as Henry Frankenstein, and so is Dwight Frye as Fritz, even though he was typecast. The 1933 version of The Invisible Man is where James Whale mixed in dark humor and science fiction in a great way. The invisibility effects are some of the best of its time, and it's impressive what the effects team did to make it believable that Invisible Man was real. What was real, of course, was Claude Rains, and his mad dictator-like performance that dominates every scene he is in. The comedy scenes are very funny, and shows the perspective of how the Invisible Man sees everything as a joke. Bride of Frankenstein is the best sequel in the Universal monster movies. The big reason why is that both Henry Frankenstein and the monster grew as characters. The monster is a lot more sympathetic this time around, and the movie ironically follows the book a lot better than the first movie. I also like the theme of duality where Henry has to choose between creating life the natural way with his angelic Elizabeth, or the unnatural way with the devilish Dr. Pretorius. Although Elsa Lanchester's screen time as the monster is made is noticeably brief, it left an impact nonetheless. The original Wolfman is what I consider to be the quintessential fall or autumn movie. It is an Americanized Greek tragedy, and Lon Chaney Jr. perfectly embodies that in his performance. While there is never a shot of the full moon in the movie, it is one of, if not the best werewolf movie ever made, and the makeup work by Jack Pierce is my personal favorite. The soundtrack is also iconic for being fearsome, yet extremely sympathetic in a lovely way. Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein is my favorite horror comedy. It could also be argued that it's at least the best Abbott and Costello movie ever made, or at least their most famous movie. It works so well because you have monster characters who have been proven to be scary in the horror genre, while also having the comic duo to balance things out in their masterful comedy. Everybody loves the chick scene, but my favorite is when they don't take Larry Talbot seriously.
In a half an hour, the moon will rise and I'll turn into a wolf.
You and 20 million other guys.
Listen, I might tear you limb from limb.
Is that serious?
He'll murder you.
That's serious.
Creature from the Black Lagoon is a thrilling jungle monster movie. It's a fun time to watch both as a horror movie and as an adventure movie. The Gillman scenes are great with his sheer screen presence, and it's one of the most iconic monster designs of all time. Who is also as eye-catching as Julie Adams, whose swimming scene with the Gillman is suspenseful with undertones of romance. The 1999 remake of The Mummy is an amazing movie that I absolutely love. It perfectly balances several genres including action, horror, comedy, and romance. It does use the basic plot points from the original, but it has so much fun with its new twist, and does the right thing to have its own identity. Brendan Fraser is great as a reluctant hero, and Rachel Weisz is fantastic as the smart and lovely leading lady of the movie. The CGI is aged like fine wine, the jokes still work, and it's the kind of movie that makes me feel happy with escapism. Van Helsing is a criminally underrated movie. It tipped its hat to the old Universal monster movies, but it was not afraid to do something different. It did an excellent job at giving reasons why the monsters were there, and the designs of the monsters as well as the visual effects that brought them to life are great. I also liked how they humanized the Frankenstein monster, and the movie's soundtrack is phenomenal. I am happy that this movie has gotten more positive attention throughout the years, and I hope that continues. So anyway, thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe.